A mother is supposed to protect her child at all costs. A judge is supposed to uphold the law, not break it. But what happens when a woman sworn to justice becomes the very thing she once condemned? A respected Alabama judge. A 3-week-old baby. And a crime so horrifying, it left an entire nation in disbelief. How did a woman trusted with the lives of others commit the unthinkable? And was it truly madness, or something far more sinister? This is the shocking case of Judge Ayanna Whitfield, a woman who once held the power to sentence criminals. Until one night, when she became the criminal herself. A story of heartbreak, mental unraveling, and a crime that will forever haunt those who heard it. Welcome to Everyday True Crime, where we bring you the most chilling real-life cases that will leave you questioning everything. If you love gripping crime stories, be sure to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell so you never miss an update. Now, let's get into it. Ayanna Whitfield had spent years building a life of prestige and honor. As a judge in Birmingham, Alabama, she was known for her sharp intellect, unwavering composure, and fierce dedication to the law. She was the woman attorneys feared in the courtroom but respected behind closed doors. To the outside world, her life was perfect. She was married to Devin Whitfield, a charismatic businessman who, on the surface, appeared to be the perfect husband. They were the couple people envied, the power duo, the picture of success. But behind the elegant dinner parties and high-profile appearances, Ayanna longed for something more. A child. For years, she and Devin had tried, suffering disappointment after disappointment. Until finally, her prayers were answered. She gave birth to a beautiful baby girl, Amora, her miracle, her greatest joy. But joy turned to devastation in an instant. Just 3 weeks after their daughter's birth, Ayanna's world crumbled. Devin blindsided her. Without warning, without remorse, he packed his bags and walked out. For another woman. The same man who had held her hand through every doctor's appointment. The man who had kissed her forehead as she brought their child into the world. Gone. Ayanna was left alone. No explanation. No closure. Just silence. And in that silence, darkness crept in. The weight of new motherhood pressed on her chest like an iron grip. The late-night feedings, the constant crying, the exhaustion so deep it blurred reality. She had spent years sentencing criminals, but nothing had prepared her for this. The loneliness. The betrayal. The slow, sinking feeling that she was drowning. And then, the voices started. Whispers in the back of her mind. Soft at first, then louder. Until they became impossible to ignore. Ayanna Whitfield had spent her life mastering control. In the courtroom, she commanded authority with a single glance. Her presence alone could silence an entire room. But at home, in the dimly lit nursery where her daughter's cries echoed off the walls, she was losing herself. It started with exhaustion. The kind that seeped into her bones, making even the smallest movements feel like lifting bricks. Her body, still healing from childbirth, ached in places she never noticed before. Sleep was a luxury she no longer had. Every night bled into the next, an endless cycle of diaper changes, feedings, and desperate attempts to soothe a screaming baby who never seemed to settle. Her mind raced with thoughts she couldn't control. What had she done wrong? Why wouldn't Amora stop crying? And then, there was the silence. The moments when the baby slept, and the house fell into an eerie, suffocating stillness. That's when the thoughts crept in. It wasn't just the exhaustion. It was the loneliness. Devin's absence left a gaping hole in her world. She still replayed the moment he walked out, the image burned into her mind. He hadn't even looked back. Her friends tried to reach out. Her mother called, offering to come help with the baby, but Ayanna refused. She wasn't some helpless woman who needed saving. At least, that's what she told herself. But the truth was far more sinister. The woman who once thrived on structure and discipline was unraveling at the seams. She barely ate, surviving on cold coffee and whatever scraps she could force down between feedings. She didn't shower for days at a time, the effort feeling like too much. The walls of her home, once a place of comfort, now felt like a prison. She would sit in the rocking chair for hours, staring blankly at the walls while Amora slept in her crib. Sometimes she would cry, but mostly, she felt nothing. A void. The vibrant, confident woman who once delivered powerful verdicts in court was now a shell of herself. She barely recognized the reflection in the mirror, sunken eyes, pale skin, lips chapped from dehydration. When her colleagues called to check in, she ignored them. She hadn't set foot in a courtroom since giving birth, and she had no desire to return. The idea of standing before a jury, pretending to be in control, felt laughable. Her entire life had been about justice, about balance. But now, there was no balance. There was only chaos. And no one, not her friends, not her family, not even Ayanna herself, knew just how dark her thoughts had become. The night was cold. A sharp wind rattled the windows, seeping through the cracks of Ayanna Whitfield's grand home. Outside, the darkness stretched endlessly, swallowing the quiet suburban street in an eerie stillness. Inside, however, there was no quiet. Amora's cries pierced the air, relentless and sharp, slicing through Ayanna's already fragile mind. She stood in the kitchen, gripping the counter with trembling fingers. Her breath came in shallow, uneven gasps. Her body, still weak from childbirth, ached under the weight of exhaustion, but none of it compared to the ache in her mind. The crying never stopped. It had been going on for hours now, or maybe just minutes. Time had become meaningless in the haze of sleepless nights and overwhelming isolation. The baby screamed, her tiny lungs working with desperate force, her face red and scrunched in distress. Ayanna bounced her gently, her arms stiff, her grip almost too tight. But the sound. The sound was unbearable. It clawed at the inside of her skull, twisting into something monstrous. It wasn't just crying anymore. It was wailing. Shrieking. Suffocating. A noise that scraped against her sanity like nails on glass. Ayanna squeezed her eyes shut, shaking her head violently. She couldn't think. She couldn't breathe. Her thoughts, once so sharp and controlled, now felt like a storm raging inside her skull. She had been strong once. Hadn't she? She had fought for everything in her life, her career, her marriage, her reputation. She had stood in courtrooms and sent criminals away with unwavering confidence. And yet here she was, utterly powerless. She opened her eyes, staring down at the small, helpless life in her arms. Tears streamed down the baby's cheeks, her tiny fists clenching in distress. A voice inside Ayanna's head whispered. "Make it stop." Her hands trembled. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears. She turned, her gaze shifting toward the back door. Beyond it, the backyard stretched into the night. The cold, silent night. Her 3 dogs, massive Rottweilers, paced restlessly near the fence. They had always been trained for protection. Loyal. Strong. Unwavering in their instincts. Ayanna swallowed hard, her mouth dry as sandpaper. The crying didn't stop. It never stopped. And then, something inside her broke. The last shred of reason, of control, of logic, snapped like a brittle thread. She didn't think. She didn't feel. She just moved. With slow, mechanical steps, she walked toward the back door. Her bare feet dragged against the cold tile. Her fingers gripped the doorknob, twisting it open. The wind howled through the opening, rushing in like an icy breath of death. She stepped outside. The grass was damp beneath her feet. Her breath curled in front of her face like ghostly tendrils. The dogs perked up immediately, their large heads tilting in confusion. Their eyes gleamed in the darkness, their bodies tensed with anticipation. Ayanna lowered herself to her knees. For the first time that night, the baby's cries slowed. Not because she had calmed, but because the cold air shocked her tiny body. Ayanna hesitated. Something flickered deep inside her. A moment of clarity. But the voice returned. She's better off. You're better off. Her hands moved before she could stop them. She placed Amora down. Right there. On the damp, frozen grass. The baby whimpered. Her tiny legs kicked weakly. The dogs took a cautious step forward, sniffing the air, uncertain. Then, instinct took over. One of them lunged. Ayanna blinked. The world seemed to tilt. Her body felt weightless, floating in the frozen night air. Amora's cries turned to screams. High-pitched. Desperate. And then, silence. It happened in seconds. One moment, she was there. The next, she was gone. The breath left Ayanna's lungs in a sharp, broken sob. Reality slammed into her like a freight train, shattering the fog in her mind. What had she done? Her mouth opened, a strangled, animalistic wail escaping her lips. She lunged forward, reaching, grasping, screaming. No. 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 The dogs backed away, confused by her sudden hysteria. But it was too late. The weight of what she had done hit her like a tidal wave, knocking her backward, stealing the air from her lungs. She collapsed onto the ground, fingers digging into the dirt, rocking back and forth as a guttural scream tore from her throat. The world around her blurred, the night swallowing her whole. She had just done the unthinkable. And nothing, no excuse, no regret, no agony, could ever undo it. The moment Ayanna hung up the phone, the house felt unbearably silent. The walls seemed to close in, pressing against her, suffocating her. The lie she had just told, the carefully crafted story, hung heavy in the air like thick smoke. Her chest heaved as she paced the living room, her fingers twitching at her sides. Had she sounded convincing? Had they believed her? The seconds dragged into minutes, stretching endlessly, until... The sirens. That wailing, piercing sound sliced through the night, growing louder with every passing moment. The flashing red and blue lights painted the street, bouncing off the windows, turning her once peaceful home into a crime scene. She ran to the door just as the first officer stepped out of his patrol car. She had to play the part. She had to be the broken, devastated mother. She threw open the door, her face contorted in grief. They killed her, she sobbed, collapsing onto the porch. My dogs, they killed my baby. The scene was chaotic. Paramedics rushed toward the backyard, officers swarming past them, their hands on their holsters. They weren't sure what they were walking into. Ayanna was inconsolable, rocking back and forth on the porch steps. One officer knelt beside her, placing a hand on her shoulder. Ma'am, I know this is difficult, but we need to know exactly what happened. Ayanna's breath hitched as she forced the words out between sobs. I put her to bed. She was fine. I was exhausted, I must have dozed off, and then I woke up and... Her voice broke into a wail. They must have gotten into the nursery. I don't know how. I don't know how this happened. The officer gave her a long, measured look before nodding. Okay. Stay here. We'll handle everything. Inside the house, the investigators wasted no time. They took in every detail. Every corner of the home. Every inch of the pristine nursery, untouched. No signs of forced entry. No signs of struggle. No overturned crib. No blood splatters inside the room where Ayanna claimed the attack had started. But the backyard, that was different. That was a crime scene. The paramedics could only shake their heads. It was far too late. And the dogs, her well-trained, obedient guard dogs, were just standing there. Not aggressive. Not panicked. Just waiting. As if they had been commanded. Ayanna sat on the couch, gripping a throw pillow to her chest, her sobs subsiding into soft, shuddering gasps. The lead detective entered the room, taking a seat across from her. "Ayanna," he said, his voice calm but firm, "I need to ask you some questions." She nodded rapidly, her hands shaking. "I'll tell you everything, I just don't understand how this happened." "We don't either." His eyes didn't leave hers. "There are no signs of forced entry. No evidence that the dogs forced their way into the nursery." She opened her mouth, but he continued. "And we have security cameras." Her stomach twisted violently. Her pulse pounded in her ears. The footage. She had forgotten about the footage. The entire property had cameras. Not just the front door. Not just the living room. The backyard. The hallway. And the nursery. Her mind reeled as she struggled to keep her breathing steady. "There's footage," she whispered. The detective nodded. His expression was unreadable. "Ayanna, we have footage of you." Her entire body went cold. In the other room, the officers reviewed the video in stunned silence. There she was. Walking calmly down the hall. Opening the nursery door. Cradling her newborn daughter. Then, stepping outside. The timestamp was clear. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a mother who had slept through a horrific tragedy. She had walked outside, clutching that tiny baby in her arms. And then. The moment that sent a chill through every officer in that room. She knelt down. Placed the baby on the ground. And stood back. Waiting. The detective leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "Ayanna, we saw everything." She clutched the pillow tighter, her body trembling. "No, no, that's not. We saw you carry her outside." Her breath came in short, shallow gasps. "We saw you put her down." A sob tore through her throat. "And we saw you watch." A wretched, broken sound escaped her lips as her entire body caved in on itself. The lie was over. The performance had crumbled. There was nothing left to hide behind. The officers moved in, standing on either side of her. "Ayanna Whitfield," the detective said, his voice firm, "you are under arrest for the murder of your daughter." Her vision blurred, the room spinning around her. The cold metal of the handcuffs clamped around her wrists. She let out a choked sob, shaking her head violently. "No, no, I didn't mean to. Ayanna." She met the detective's gaze, her tear-streaked face crumpling. "It wasn't me," she whispered. Her voice was small. Broken. It was the depression. The words hung in the air. But no one answered. Because no one believed her anymore. The courtroom was packed. News cameras lined the back wall. Reporters scribbled furiously in their notepads. The entire country was watching. Judge Ayanna Whitfield, once a respected figure in Alabama's justice system, was now the accused. The woman who had once handed down life sentences was now fighting to escape one herself. The prosecution wasted no time. They painted a brutal, unforgiving picture. Ayanna Whitfield wasn't a grieving mother. She was a woman scorned. A wife abandoned. And in her rage, she had taken the ultimate revenge, on the most innocent soul. They called her, calculating. Cold-blooded. A woman who had been trained to uphold the law, but had chosen to break it in the most horrific way possible. The footage didn't lie. The jurors watched in stunned silence as the prosecution played the grainy, black-and-white video from the security cameras. Ayanna's figure moving down the hallway. Cradling her newborn daughter. Stepping outside into the night. Placing the baby down. And waiting. Several jurors looked away. Some covered their mouths. The footage alone was damning. But the prosecution had more. They brought in expert witnesses, psychiatrists who testified that Ayanna had shown no signs of severe psychosis. No history of delusions. No break from reality. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't insanity. It was murder. And they wanted her to pay for it. The defense fought back. They told a different story. A story of a woman drowning in the depths of postpartum depression. A woman who had just been abandoned by the man she trusted most. A woman who had spent weeks alone, spiraling deeper into darkness. They called in medical experts who testified about the devastating effects of untreated postpartum disorders. Psychiatrists who explained that severe depression could lead to a complete break from reality. They argued that Ayanna wasn't a killer. She was sick. And she needed help, not a life sentence. Then came the most anticipated moment of the trial. Devin Whitfield. Ayanna's ex-husband. The man who had walked out on her and their newborn daughter. The moment he took the stand, the tension in the courtroom thickened. Reporters whispered furiously into their microphones. Jurors leaned forward. Everyone wanted to hear what he had to say. And he didn't hold back. She wasn't some broken woman who lost control, he said, his voice sharp. She knew exactly what she was doing. His words cut through the courtroom like a blade. She wanted me to suffer. She wanted to punish me. And she knew the one thing that would hurt me the most. He turned to the jury, his expression unreadable. She didn't kill our daughter because of depression. His voice dropped. She killed her out of revenge. The trial dragged on for weeks. The nation was divided. Was Ayanna a victim of her own mind? Or a calculated murderer hiding behind a mental illness? The jury deliberated for 3 days. And then. The verdict. Ayanna stood as the judge addressed the courtroom. Her hands trembled at her sides. Her face was pale. The air felt suffocating. The entire room held its breath. The jury foreman stood. On the charge of first-degree murder. A beat of silence. We find the defendant guilty. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Ayanna's legs buckled. Her mouth fell open in a silent sob. Her lawyer placed a hand on her shoulder, whispering something in her ear. But she couldn't hear it. She couldn't hear anything. Her heart was pounding too loudly. The judge's voice rang out over the murmurs in the room. Ayanna Whitfield, you have been found guilty of the premeditated murder of your 3-week-old daughter. Given the severity of this crime, and the overwhelming evidence against you, this court has no choice but to impose the maximum sentence. Ayanna's breath caught in her throat. You are hereby sentenced to life in prison, without the possibility of parole. Her body crumbled as the weight of those words crashed down on her. Life. No parole. No second chances. This was it. She had spent years sending criminals to prison. Now, she was one of them. The cold steel of the handcuffs wrapped around her wrists. She barely felt them. Her mind was frozen. Her life was over. And the world would never forgive her. The case of Judge Ayanna Whitfield shook the nation. For months, her name dominated headlines. Talk shows dissected every detail. True crime podcasts debated whether justice had truly been served. And across the country, people found themselves divided. To some, Ayanna was a monster. A woman who had once sworn to uphold the law, only to break it in the most unthinkable way. A murderer who had tried to hide behind mental illness. A woman who had no right to sympathy. No excuse. No redemption. To others, she was a tragic figure. A woman abandoned at her most vulnerable. Drowning. Advocates demanded more awareness of postpartum psychosis, how it could twist reality, how it could lead even the most loving mothers to the brink of something unthinkable. But no awareness campaign could bring back what was lost. And what about Devin Whitfield? The man who had walked away from his wife and newborn child. He never spoke publicly about the case again. Never sat for interviews. Never expressed guilt or regret. He moved on. Built a new life. Married the woman he had left Ayanna for. And he never looked back. But the one life that mattered most, was gone forever. A helpless, innocent baby girl. A life that had barely begun. A life that ended in the most horrific way imaginable. And no trial, no verdict, no prison sentence could ever undo what had been done. Some crimes have no explanation, no justification, only devastation. Ayanna Whitfield was a woman trusted to uphold the law. But in the end, she broke it in the most horrifying way imaginable. If this case left you speechless, there's more where that came from. Subscribe to Everyday True Crime for more shocking real-life stories. Like this video and hit the notification bell, because in the world of crime, the truth is always more disturbing than fiction.